Religious diversity within a family can fester unfixable conflict, or different traditions can coexist peacefully. Location can also influence one's religious views, as well as the trials they may endure because of them. Today I will explore how place shaped the religious views of my family members, and how those different views are ultimately able to peacefully coexist despite occasional conflicts. Religious diversity has always been present in my family, going back several generations, and it has been very present throughout my life. The two main religious groups in my family are Jewish and atheistic. My father's side of the family is mainly Jewish, and my mom's side is atheistic. I interviewed my parents and grandparents to get their viewpoints on the religious diversity in our family. I asked them how they saw religious diversity in our family, and how the places they have lived throughout their lives affected their views on religious diversity. Finally, I asked them how living in the Bay Area, where I grew up and where they all live now, compares to those other places. I will begin by discussing my dad's side of the family, starting with my paternal grandfather. He grew up Jewish in New York City, specifically as a Romanian Jew. The Romanians are a group of Jews who have been a part of the diaspora in Greece for around 2,300 years, and are distinct from the Sephardic Jews in Greece. He attended Cahelia Kadosha Janina, an Orthodox Romanite synagogue, which is today the only Romanite synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. Although New York City is very religiously diverse, he grew up in an area where he was almost exclusively surrounded by other Jews. After earning an undergraduate degree in New York City, my grandfather went to Duke University to get his graduate degree, moving him to Durham, North Carolina, which is also where he met my grandmother. My grandmother had a completely different religious background. She was a recent immigrant from France and had grown up Catholic. My grandparents recall that my grandmother not being Jewish was one of the largest issues they had to contend with early in their relationship, but it was an issue they overcame. My grandfather's mother took issue with my grandfather marrying a non-Jewish girl, but my grandmother converted to Judaism before they married. Being married in a Jewish ceremony with a conservative rabbi presiding was enough to ultimately have my great-grandmother accept the union. Religious differences were not debilitating to their relationship, and they have been happily married for over 50 years. They lived in a lot of different places, as my grandfather's postdoctoral academic career was developing, including Boston, Pasadena, Durham again, and then Tucson. My dad and his two brothers were born in Tucson, and then the family moved a final time to Birmingham, Alabama, where my grandfather had a job with the University of Alabama. My father and uncles spent the majority of their childhoods in the Birmingham area, specifically in a suburb called Vestavia Hills. Now I will talk about my dad's early experiences with religious diversity, growing up Jewish in a predominantly Protestant area. Even though there was a sizable Jewish community in the Birmingham area, mostly made up of people associated with the university, almost all of the Jews in the area lived in a different suburb, called Mountain Brook. In Mountain Brook, there were 3 synagogues, one Reform, one Conservative, and one Orthodox, as well as a Jewish community center. Even though there was this Jewish community close by, my dad recalls that he and his brothers were essentially the only Jews in Vestavia Hills. The result was that they had plenty of Jewish friends through their synagogue community, but they also had plenty of non-Jewish friends through school. My dad describes Birmingham as someplace where religion was a visible, overt, and very important part of one's identity. He recalls the environment around religious identity was the antithesis of how he perceives the Bay Areas to be. One's religious affiliation was an essential part of identity in the South, whereas nobody seems to care about or consider religious affiliation during regular interactions in the Bay Area. My dad did experience anti-Semitism growing up, although he recalls that these instances almost always occurred in group settings. During one-on-one interactions, people were always accepting and open-minded regarding differences. Common examples of anti-Semitism he recalls are other kids telling him that he would go to hell for not believing in Jesus, or situations where teachers would create extra credit questions that were based in Bible verses. However, in other situations, such as when my grandmother baked a dreidel-shaped cake and talked to my dad's elementary school class about Hanukkah, there was little issue. Overall, my dad described his experience growing up Jewish in the Bible Belt as one where he constantly felt like the other, something that affected his sense of identity. Now, I will transition to discussing my mom's side of the family. My maternal grandparents have fairly similar religious backgrounds and similar development of their views on religion. Both of them grew up attending Presbyterian churches in the Los Angeles area, and both of them attended UC Santa Barbara and majored in anthropology. In college, they were introduced to concepts such as biological evolution and cultural relativism that caused them to move away from their upbringings. They describe that their view on religion is summed up in a statement from one of their anthropology readings. All faith is false, all faith is true. Truth is the shattered mirror strewn in myriad bits, while each believes his own little bit the whole to own. They no longer subscribe to any religious traditions, but they still enjoy celebrating holidays like Easter and Christmas in a manner that is completely devoid of all the religious aspects of these holidays. My mom describes it as celebrating the holidays as Hallmark holidays. My maternal grandparents have also lived in many different places that have influenced their views on religion and religious diversity. In addition to Southern California, they have lived in Alberta, New Zealand, Fiji, French Polynesia, the Cook Islands, and Spain as part of their studies and careers in anthropology. Living in each of these places added to their views on cultural relativism and being accepting of other faiths. Eventually, they settled in Modesto, California, to teach at the community college there. This is where my mom was raised. I will now transition to my mom's experiences with religion growing up. She recalls that the majority of people around her were Christian, either Protestant or Catholic. Similar to where my dad grew up, religious affiliation was an important part of how one was perceived. She recalls instances such as when groups of kids from the large Baptist church in the area would all pray together before a test, where the teacher left the room for a few minutes. Also similar to my dad's upbringing was the fact that most families who differed from this Christian norm were connected to the college in some way. My mom was raised without religious affiliation, with the addition of my grandparents' views on cultural relativism and the celebration of non-religious versions of Christmas and Easter. Now I will discuss how religious diversity affected my parents' relationship. Both my mom and dad recall that differences in religion was the only major point of conflict they had early in their relationship. My mom and her family desired to celebrate Christmas and Easter, while my dad was adamantly against having Christian cultural norms thrust upon him, due to aspects of his upbringing. However, they were able to compromise. For instance, my mom made my dad a stocking that was blue and had a Star of David on it as a compromise on Christmas decorations. Over time, my dad came to understand that my mom's version of traditionally Christian holidays had little undertone of religion at all. My dad described my family's version of these holidays as similar to how Halloween is usually celebrated in the U.S., a holiday that once had religious context but is no longer celebrated in that way. Finally, there's my experiences with religion. I have grown up with the hallmark Christmas and Easter of my mom's family and their views of cultural relativism and acceptance of religious diversity. I also grew up in the Bay Area, one of the most religiously diverse areas in the world. However, I have also celebrated traditional Jewish holidays such as Hanukkah and Passover, although usually in association with my dad's extended family. Outside of those holidays, however, my family are not really observant Jews. My father decided to not raise my brother and I with a traditional Jewish education, meaning that neither of us ever had a bar or bat mitzvah ceremony. My dad shared that this is because he felt that in the Bay Area, it didn't feel like it was necessary to imbue us with a deep religious identity. His experience in the South was that if one didn't have a deep sense of religious identity, they would be swallowed up, but he is happy that the Bay Area is different from this environment. Based on my own experiences growing up, I do agree with his assessment. I never felt like my lack of a solid, single religious identity was an issue growing up. In fact, I knew other families just like mine, sort of Jewish, but also celebrated hallmark versions of Christian holidays. The experience of my brother and I contrasts to the upbringing of my cousins, who were raised with a Jewish education at a Reformed synagogue, also in the Bay Area. Through them, and especially their bar and bat mitzvah ceremonies, I have learned more about the Jewish part of my identity. I am still unsure about exactly what my family's history of religious diversity means to me, but I am happy that I was raised with many religious perspectives, where different religious perspectives were able to peacefully coexist. As shown by the experiences of my family members, religions can peacefully coexist through compromise. Additionally, the place one grows up in and how accepting it is of different religious views can dramatically influence worldview. The acceptance of different religions within California, and especially the Bay Area, make religiously diverse families like mine possible.